morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever it is that we find ourselves across all our oceans and continents. You are each one very, very welcome to this webinar. We are very grateful for your presence and for the work that you do. I am Mary Babic, a congregational leader of the Sisters of Notre Dame de Sion, Our Lady of Sion. And at the moment I find myself in Canada, although normally I would be in Rome. I want to let you know and remind you that this webinar is organized and has been sponsored by the joint heads of the Superior Generals of the UISG, the Women's Branch, and the USG, the Men's Branch, and together form the Dialogue Commission of the two groups. For our webinar today, we are grateful to have the interpretation of Ilaria, who will help us for our translation in English and in French. And also just a short reminder that we have our three speakers, each of whom we welcome and for whom we are grateful to have their input and their sharing with us this morning. I will introduce each one before he or she begins. After the three presentations, there will be a time of questions. We hope it will be approximately half an hour. And as you listen to the speakers, if you would like to record your questions, you can write them in the chat to me, to myself, or to Claudia. You will also have her information there to be able to write questions, and we will try to read them and to keep track of the questions so that we might be able to have an exchange at the end of the presentations. So we would like to begin now this next part of our meeting, knowing that Pope Francis is calling all of us, the whole world, but the church and religious congregations, religious life, especially to the importance of interreligious dialogue as even a priority for religious life today. And he calls us, of course, to an attitude of openness and truth in dialogue with believers, despite all the various obstacles and difficulties, some of which we live from very close and most immediately. And we think especially of the situations around the world of violence and of distrust that are based also on religion, and especially to what is happening in these days in the places of conflict around the world. And so we want to begin with a prayer from Fratelli Tutti, which Claudia will read and introduce for us, and then we will begin with our first speaker, Sister Chantal. So again, know that you are each very, very welcome, and we are grateful to be together.
Thank you, Sister Mary. In the name of the Father, of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen.
Lord, Father of our human family, you created all human beings equal in dignity. Pour forth into our hearts a fraternal spirit and inspire in us a dream of renewed encounter, dialogue, justice, and peace. Move us to create healthier societies and a more dignified world, a world without hunger, poverty, violence, and war. May our hearts be open to all the peoples and nations of the earth. May we recognize the goodness and beauty that you have sown in each of us, and thus forge bonds of unity, common projects, and shared dreams. Amen. In the name of the Father, of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen. So perhaps this morning especially we could remember and be in solidarity with the people of northwestern Nigeria and the abduction of the young schoolgirls that Pope Francis also mentioned in the Angelus yesterday, and just be aware of all the situations that need peace and reconciliation. So we will begin with Sister Chantal. So now I will like to introduce her and to do so in French. So Sœur Chantal est une sœur missionnaire de Notre-Dame d'Afrique. Anciennement, elle était assistante générale de son institut religieux. Elle a travaillé dans plusieurs pays d'Afrique, en Rwanda, Ouganda, Kenya, comme infirmière accoucheuse et en Afrique du Nord, en Algérie et Tunisie. Elle est diplômée de l'Institut pontifical d'islamologie et d'études arabes et de l'Institut de sciences et de théologie des religions de l'Institut catholique de Paris. Actuellement, elle est directrice du Centre d'études diocésaines Les Glycines à Alger. Vous êtes très bienvenue, Sœur Chantal.
Merci
C'est à vous la parole.
Thank you very much, Sister Mary. I will therefore going to present a PowerPoint. Well, first of all, I would like to share my screen, and I would like to present this center, the Centre Les Glycines, just to show that we are actually a platform of dialogue in this world. You can see, I hope. So who are we? Well, first of all, we are a center of studies that's named Les Glycines. It is a research center and training institution devoted particularly on the study of the history of Algeria and all its cultural, linguistic, and religious heritage, and on the other hand, to the promotion of dialogue between cultures and religions. The center was created by the Diocese of Algiers, and it has developed, organized, and reoriented in osmosis with the Catholic Church of Algeria on the one hand and the Algerian society on the other. So since the crisis of the 90s, with the reduction in numbers, the center has sought to keep its original place in Algeria and the spirit of its founders. I would like to briefly tell you a bit the history of the center, just to show you that we have always remained faithful. In the summer of 1966, Cardinal Duval, who at the time was the Archbishop of Algiers, had decided to set up a study center in his diocese to teach the languages of Algeria and its culture. Well, first of all, to the members of the Christian communities and to foreigners, but also to French-speaking Algerians who might wish to do so. So this structure was also meant to establish a relationship of dialogue with Algerian society through conferences or meetings and through its library open to researchers. And Cardinal Duval entrusted Father Tessier with the responsibility of the Diocesan Center for Language and Pastoral Studies in Cuba, and then in Les Glycines in 1970. The intuition of the two founders, as you can see in the photo, in the image, Fathers Henri Tessier and Blessed Pierre Claverie, was supported by the requirement formulated by the Second Vatican Council that the Catholic Church should show solidarity with the human and cultural environment in which it is and take an interest in its heritage, in particular to Islam, not for the purpose of proselytism, but to appreciate the Muslim tradition in its spiritual and religious dimension. It is in this spirit that the center has been organizing itself since 1970, in particular preparing to training courses on the knowledge of Algeria, Islam, and interreligious dialogue to prepare for encounters with Muslim believers. The center has, in the course of its history, developed a certain influence, and it has been a bit like an interface between the Catholic Church and the Algerian academic and cultural world, and this is something which still goes on today. So you can also see that in the image. You have Monseigneur Tessier. He was always sitting around a table where he would meet people. It was a very convivial meeting. And also, of course, Monseigneur Pierre Clavier. We organize a number of activities in order to fulfill this mission. Well, in particular, a research library. So under the impetus of Father Tessier, the Center of Studies quickly acquired a privileged instrument for the knowledge and study of Algeria. And it is a research library which brings together various private collections patiently built up throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, donations from the libraries of various Christian institutions in the city of Algiers, major seminary, White Fathers, White Sisters, Jesuits, and Dominicans. It was regularly enriched by legacies and covers several fields: the history of Algeria and the Maghreb, geography, archaeology, architecture, Maghreb literature in Arabic and French, the cartography of Algeria and the Maghreb, linguistics, and the study of Maghreb Arab and Berber dialects, anthropology, ethnography, Islamic studies, and interreligious dialogue. So as you can see, it provides a wide range of elements. So in 1972, at the we had a first director who was a specialist in Saint Augustine, just like Mr. Tessier. And then we also have Charles Robert, who is more focused on contemporary Algeria. So we have actually an incredible wealth that we actually can provide to all those who are interested. We also provide teaching languages. So the language teaching. So to learn the language or to teach the language of a people is to prepare oneself to belong to them. This was the conviction of Father Tessier, who was himself a perfect Arabic and Berber speaker. So he set up a team of Algerian academics as permanent members who were trained in linguistics and didactics, who in 1971 developed a method of teaching Algerian dialect Arabic, the Kamal method. However, always upon request of Father Tessier, they were teaching literary Arabic since 1972, which contributes to the Arabization of Algerian academics and administrative executives in the context of the policy of Arabization of the teaching of human and social sciences and administration, initiated in Algeria in 1970. So you notice there's a full link between the Catholic Church, follows up the evolution of the local society. We have recently added the teaching of Tamazight Kabylie language. So our students come from abroad, so they include language students, but we also have executives of foreign companies, civil servants, diplomats, anyone who wishes to communicate quickly with their environment, not forgetting that if you actually want to meet the other, it is fundamental to learn their language and to be able to share. If you can speak to the other, in his language, that changes completely the relationship. And this has been one of the convictions from the very beginning of the founding fathers. We also organize conferences which are regularly held together with the academic world as well as with Algerian researchers. So this becomes a place of encounter and of exchange with the actual academic world in the various fields of human and social sciences, fostering critical thinking and reflection. We, of course, together with the students and researchers, we organize scientific and training activities be it study days, sessions on the methodology of scientific writing for master and doctoral students in the human sciences, intensive sessions on ancient languages like Latin, Greek, and Hebrew, which are actually the languages that the archaeologists and the historians of antiquity are most interested in. We also provide accommodation. And so you're most welcome to all of you who want to work, maybe have studies or research concerning the Maghreb and the Mediterranean area. So the center actually continues to act as an interface between the various stakeholders worldwide, all those who want to learn the history of Maghreb and Algeria. Cardinal Duval, from the very beginning, entrusted this center with a particular mission, which was to animate and ensure, in the name of the diocese, the witness of respect for the Church's esteem for the cultures of Algeria and for the religious tradition that animates them. So the theological foundation is to be found in the text of Vatican Council II, as well as the Algerian independence, Nostra Aetate et Lumen Gens. So basically the director, Prouveau, has actually spurred and encouraged all of the activities which have been after followed by Pierre Claverie. The two, Monseigneur Tessier and Claverie, together, they actually focused also and worked on a theological reflection on the meaning of our encounters. What does the presence of a church that does not seek to convert others to itself, but to give a free testimony of fraternal love mean? Well, all of the directors, so Tessier and Monseigneur Pierre Claverie, all followed the same principle, underlying one or the other aspect of encounter. You can see here we have our sister, Lucie Prouveau. She is a specialist, a legal expert on the women's rights in Maghreb, and she has also promoted a respectful study of the of Islam, of the Muslim religion, in full respect, in order to better understand that. So in order to be formed in the purification of the imaginary and imagination that we could develop towards our neighbors. So today, the Diocesan Center represents a tool of encounter, of study, and also a place of experimentation of both cultural dialogue, interreligious dialogue, and dialogue on life as such. So we basically continue to provide a free witness and of esteem of the Catholic Church for all the cultures of this country and of its different religions and religious tradition. Allow me just to underline a few aspects. That is, I would like to mention the main characteristics of our church today. So our church is actually a church of encounter, a church called to be dialogue, hospitable. And during the works, our bishops had chosen the icon of the visitation, because we are always in visitation. We go towards the other and we welcome the other, together with the mystery that the other embodies. So just like Father Tessier or Monsignor Tessier, who has unfortunately passed away just 2 months ago, we are a church for a Muslim people, as Tessier said after Cardinal Duval. Both of them, that is Cardinal Duval and Father Dessier, and the 19 martyrs that you can see here in the small images, and many others have served the vocation of our church to be a church of encounter and fraternity for all, to pay attention and interest in the life of each of one. And also Father Tessier could live that, and I have a first-hand testimony. He was saying that the other is for me the face of God, and welcome me the other, it is God himself that I welcome. And to what extent Father Tessier had actually people coming to visit him at the center, at the diocesan center. And I can tell you anyone from the simple housewife to the eminent experts, and he always welcomed them in the same way. The Christian community is not centered on itself, but attentive to all the services it can render. So all the community is actually at the service. It is a community at the service of the other, of the population, of the peoples, of the encounter of fraternity. We are a small church. From a numerical and sociological point of view, we are very modest in terms of numbers, but nonetheless significant, because we enjoy the real recognition from the authorities and the trust of many through its recognized historical commitment to the service of health, education, and charity. The establishment of the church are at the same time places of service and meeting forums, as blessed Father Clavry used to say. So we do express fraternity on the icon of the beatification of the 19 martyrs. It is written, "There is no greater love than to lay down one's life for one's friends." And at the time, Pope Francis said that basically this will certainly be a sign in the path of fraternity and holiness of our brothers and sisters in the Algerian skyline. It's a church which remains open and leaves its door open and goes knocking on the door of the other. We are also a citizen church. It is the Church of Algeria which takes part in the exchange in society on everything that gives meaning to human life. A church that makes conversation with all. A church that dares to witness simply and freely in word and deed. A church that goes out and visits others, but also welcomes them. Here you can see the sisters of Mother Teresa, together with the women in La Casba, and in the other image, during the COVID, all of the young people were together, jointly collaborating, both Catholic and Muslims, preparing food baskets. As our bishops remind us, the North African region is geographically and culturally situated at the crossroads of Africa, Europe, and the Middle East. So the dynamics of the Arab Spring, the regional and Middle Eastern security challenges, the European economic crisis, and the new situation of migration, mainly from sub-Saharan Africa, are bringing profound changes and new challenges to our region. We are called to cope with them. And then I would like to show you as well that our church in Algeria is actually a living church and a universal living church. The majority of our communities are made up of foreigners from all continents, including priests and nuns and many students emigrating from sub-Saharan Africa, who come to knock at our doors and who are most welcome. So this was just to give you a bit of an idea and an image of what we are actually living. And I would like to thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Sister Chantal. for your sharing. Perhaps we could each take just a few seconds to be with what we have heard. And if any of us have any questions, to jot them down for ourselves, or again, I invite you perhaps to put them in the chat and we can come back to them when we have our sharing in our last minutes together, the last half hour together. So just a few seconds now to be with what we have heard.
Thank you very much, Sister Chantal. I think that the church that you represent is a church of hope. It is the church that we do hope for our entire world. So really a very sincere thank. I will now would like to introduce the next speaker. You are most welcome. Father Christoph Hoku is professor at the Catholic Institute of the Mediterranean in Marseille. He's also head of the Islamic Christian Research Center and of the program Maison de la Sagesse, as well as the seminar Humanism and Religion, gathering young researchers of that country, of European countries, also member of the board of the Institute of the Mediterranean, and is also Secretary General of Paths of Dialogue. Most welcome, Father Christoph. The floor is yours. Thank you very much. Allow me just to share my screen, just to be able to do my presentation. So good morning, good afternoon to all of you, and thank you. So there are no images. I apologize for that. Thank you very much for inviting me. The question that was addressed to me is the following. Can you focus your presentation on relations with Muslims in the age of global terrorism, which is the current situation in France, and which can be the role of religious leaders in facing these challenges? I was asked to speak about the French context, which is, of course, specific. So the comments I would like to make in my introduction are the following. First of all, yes, undoubtedly, we have witnessed acts of violence and murders which were perpetrated in the recent months of years. An attack in Nice on 14th July 2016, which was National Day, 87 dead and 434 wounded. A few days later, the assassination of Father Amel, a priest celebrating Mass near Rouen, July 26th of the same year. And then last October, the assassination of a teacher, Samuel Paty, a teacher on leaving his college. And just a few days later, 2 women in a church in Nice were also murdered, and those who committed these acts claimed to be Islamic. But if terrorism and violence occur regularly in France, we cannot say that we live daily in a context of violence or fear of terrorism. That can occur, but this is not our daily situation. And I also would like to record in this introduction the testimony of a friend born in France, of parents born in Algeria, married to a practicing Catholic, 3 children. I celebrated their marriage. They belong to a group in France, which are basically, it's just outside the church. They are believers, but it's not the church which has established that. It's the group of Islamic Christian homes. They basically hold important responsibilities in a public structure. The Louvre Museum in Paris, and he's also the first deputy mayor of a municipality in the northern suburbs of Paris. And on Sunday, he was telling me in the 80s at school, at college, in the northern suburbs of Paris, we were in classes with pupils and some of friends who came from everywhere, all over, Poland, Senegal, France for several generations. And I was born here, of parents born in Algeria. The differences were not highlighted at all. It was a matter of family belonging. It was a matter of discovery. And for us, it was rather a source of wealth. There was nothing problematic about it at school at the time. The prospects were that of integration into French society. The event of the French team winning the Football World Cup in 1998 was a very strong symbol of the French model of integration. At the time, the slogan was France, black, white, butter. I mean, French 3 Bs. It said something about the way it works and about an ideal. And then 2 events disrupted and questioned all that. First, the attacks of 11 September 2001 in New York, the Twin Towers, and then the Clichy-sous-Bois riots in France, 2005. These events revealed a deep malaise in French society, the malaise which we share today and which challenges human fraternity. So, therefore, I would like to address the specific French context from the point of view of the situation of Muslims in our society. I will try to explain the French context, and as Chantal, I will also mention the places for meetings jointly between Christians and Muslims where they can exchange and dialogue. And I also then would like to discuss what is hindering dialogue and what is hindering human integrity. And I also will conclude on what I was asked at the beginning on our role as religious leaders in this context. So my first element is to talk about France today and in which context are we called to live fraternity. Well, first of all, I apologize. You might seem a bit strange, but and a bit patriotic, but we do have our own motto of the French Republic to which all citizens hold: the liberty, equality, and fraternity. And I think it's worthwhile reminding it because all French citizens, regardless their religion, their origins, their social background, hold dear this motto. And we know that in order to actually implement this in favor of freedom and legality. We do have some laws which have been voted. However, fraternity cannot be decreed. It is an ideal that depends on the responsibility of each citizen. I like to say, at least as far as I am concerned, that this is our dual responsibility as citizens and Christians, since we believe that all human beings are created in the image and likeness of God, and that Jesus Christ has revealed to us. I think it is also good to quote, and I will mention that at the end of my speech, the first sentence of the declaration signed by Pope Francis and Sheikh Ahmed El Tayeb Al Azhar in Abu Dhabi 2 years ago, February the 4th, 2019. The first sentence is sufficient covers the entire document. Faith leads the believer to see in the other a brother, to support and to love. A second comment is that our, long and complex history of France with Muslims. France had a colonial empire in countries where almost the entire population was Muslim. The Maghreb countries were colonized by it under the form of a protectorate in Tunisia and Morocco, with an assimilation in Algeria, which was considered French territory. But what is important to say that between 1954 and 1970, Muslims were not considered as French citizens. They were considered indigenous, so they could only serve in the army. And the Algerian War of Independence, from 1954 to 1962, has left wounds on both sides to this day. Memories remain vivid and wounded, almost 60 years after independence. Today, in a country of 68 million inhabitants, people of Muslim tradition represent about 5 million people. That is almost 8% of the population living in France. Because for us, religious statistical data are forbidden, so these data are really approximate. More than 2/3 of them have French nationality, whereas for, in the mind and in the spirit, for many of our compatriots still, Muslim equals immigrant, equal Arab, sometimes equal to extremist or even terrorist. We must acknowledge that in our French society, a certain racism towards Arabs and Black people still exists. People of Muslim tradition are present in all social, professional categories, but in much higher proportions among low-skilled workers or trades. Because of this situation at the bottom of the social ladder, many Muslim families live in working-class neighborhoods on the outskirts of our cities. These working-class neighborhoods are places where many difficulties and problems exist, first of all for social and political reasons, not for religious ones. A third element, which is probably difficult for you who come from other countries with different cultural background, is secularism. Secularism is a French specificity that is difficult to explain outside our borders, the word itself often being untranslatable in English, German, or Arabic. A distinction must be made between secularization and laity. Secularization affects many contemporary societies because it is often linked to modernity. It refers to a process in which whole areas of social life are no longer dependent on the church. For example, schools, teaching. But also in the 21st century, also very important aspects of people's lives are no longer related to religion. And in this process, religion risks losing its place in social life and is confined to a private sphere. And this does not regard only France alone, while laity is a legal framework that defines the relationship between the religions, the state and religions. So the state does not intervene in the affairs of the church or of other religions and vice versa. But it's very difficult to understand. Many Muslims, including imams, confuse secularization with secularism, and they attribute the fall in religious practice in France to secularism, and this concerns also Protestants and Orthodox. Moreover, the legal framework of secularism is also a secular mentality, and a secularist ideology has developed in France over the course of a century and in opposition to the visible and social dimension of religions, starting with Islam. And this, as I said, is secularist ideology. So the fact that Islam becomes visible in France. And last comment I would like to make, Islam and Muslims in France, it is not a single piece and a single block. It's not, you always use the word Islam, but it's a mosaic. The Muslim community in France is not unified, but it is crossed, and I believe this is the case in other countries too, by multiple currents, some of which are linked to the countries of origin and the powers that are governing. Algeria, for instance, the government and the presidents of the Republic in Algeria appoints the rector of the Paris Mosque. Morocco, Turkey. These countries try to control the populations of origin and mosques. Now, for 35 years, public authorities have been trying to have a representative body of Muslims with whom to discuss issues related to worship. But they do not succeed. The French Council of Muslim Cult is not legitimate in the eyes of at least 80% of Muslims living in France. And this is where the problem comes from. One last question to actually understand the framework in which Muslims live in France. Where does violence come from? Because this question was actually part of the theme in France. Violence, well, especially in working class neighborhoods, is not primarily religious or committed in the name of religion. The most visible violence, and I'm thinking about Marseille and the northern districts in Marseille. So the most visible violence is that linked to trafficking, particularly the drug trade. This trade brings in considerable sums of money and is considered by some politicians. They believe it ensures social peace in neighborhoods where unemployment and precariousness prevail. Now, of course, when you listen on the radio that there's been a casualty, they say the police forces knew about them, and he is part of the drug trade. This kind of violence is also a kind of cry or response from people who are destabilized by globalization and see no future for them in this new world. In France, violence thus arises from people who feel forgotten by the Republic, left out of the circuits of education and social success. And in fact, violence arises in neighborhoods that become like lawless areas from which public services have gradually withdrawn. The post office, the bank disappear. And as a result, the mafias are the ones who make the law. And, for example, control, entrances and exits of the neighborhood to the extent that the police no longer goes there. So in a city which is not distant from mine with two fellow brothers, it is actually the mafia who is controlling the drug trade, and everyone is in fear. And I'm not just saying that to be admired. They come from Nigeria. So the acts, religiously motivated acts of violence, are very few compared to the daily violence suffered by poor populations who, for social reasons, often happy to be of Muslim traditions. This is just to give you a bit, setting the scene. Now, as a second theme, I would like to speak about the places or the times when, specifically Christians and Muslims meet in France, particularly Marseille, where I live. Marseille is the second largest city in France in terms of the number of inhabitants as a city, nearly 850,000 inhabitants, including about nearly 250,000, 300,000, so 1/3 of the people are of Muslim tradition. 80,000 are Christians from Armenia after the genocide. 60,000 is the Jewish community in Marseille. So where do Christians and Muslims meet? Well, in their daily life of Marseille's working class districts. But the social, cultural, and religious mix which existed in the 80s, 90s, tends to disappear. At the time, I wasn't living there. So from a religious point of view, some of these neighborhoods have become almost entirely Muslim, except for a few Christian families, often not of French origin, or one or other community of nuns or religious, often elderly. So this is exactly the life in working class neighborhoods and districts. So meetings take place in Catholic educational establishments in Marseille. The church and the dioceses have chosen to support schools in these working class districts. As a result, some Catholic schools, whether primary or secondary or college level, receive from 60 to 90% of children or pupils of Muslim faith. So maintain these schools and make them alive is actually a choice of the church in Marseille with a view to serving life together, promoting reciprocal knowledge, intercultural and interreligious dialogue, which is done not in words but in action. Third element is this in the service of prison and hospital chaplaincies, because in fact when in 1905 the law provided that public authorities would no longer subsidize churches, in the name of the freedom of conscience and worship, the people who are in these prisons could actually continue to follow their religion. And so that is why this law provided for chaplaincies. So Catholic and Protestant chaplains were the first in these places, often visiting Muslim patients or prisoners, respecting their faith. Often it was they whom these Catholic and Protestant chaplains who made their Muslim colleagues discovered the importance of listening, because in fact it did not exist in the Muslim tradition to listen to the sick and the prisoners, and the importance of being close to them as bearers of God's mercy and not judging them. And this is actually the gospel of today. Another place is represented by Islamic Christian weddings. I think you can basically discover that worldwide, that there are different situations and different realities in local churches. Often these are delicate situations, but in France, more and more couples are forming with this difference in religious and often cultural affiliation. This is less of an issue when it concerns a Muslim man marrying a Catholic woman, but it sometimes becomes very tense or even impossible, sometimes violent, when it concerns a Christian man who wants to marry a Muslim woman. Family pressure is sometimes very strong to force a Christian man to become a Muslim. However, such couples do exist. And without waiting and with the support of the church, basically this group of Islamic Christian homes has existed for more than 30 years in France. It's a place to share experiences, to accompany young couples, to reflect on the religious education of children. And now, 2 years ago, there has been also a first spiritual retreat at an abbey in France. 2 Islamic Christian couples accompanied by a priest and by a Muslim representative servant in this Cistercian abbey. So there are some gatherings between Islamic and Christians. Every year in October, November, there is an Islamic week where there are groups meeting. And then for the last 7 years, there's been also an initiative which was launched in Lebanon, has been also organized in France, together with Mary. So it's a moment of celebration, of meetings, thanks to the figure of Mary. And so we, at least in Marseille, but I mean in other cities too, a group of exchanges between Christian and Muslim women has launched an initiative of a convivial and spiritual day, open to all Christians and Muslims who wish to participate. It's normally organized on a Sunday in June, and where families with children, teenagers gather, where a moment of sharing. Well, during a long meal, then there are moments of prayer, exchanges on current themes. So that has been disseminated by word of mouth, and this initiative now brings together more than 300 people. It is prepared many weeks in advance by a group of Christians and Muslims together. And I would like to underline that for several years now, it has taken some time, but now Muslim Christian charities have been working together to carry out operations. And now for several years, these charities together, jointly, carry out operations in favor of people in precarious situations locally. For example, in Créteil, in the southern eastern suburbs of Paris, a Catholic parish and a mosque are carrying out food distributions in summer because other organizations are on holiday in that period. The COVID crisis and the containment and lockdown measures have led many families into situations of precariousness and even poverty. And where I live, in Marseille, in one neighborhood, a social organization, Christians and a Muslim collective have joined forces to help every week more than 300 families who could no longer feed their children after the 15th of the month. And it was the public school teachers who had alerted each other. So jointly, there was a lay teacher, a Catholic, of social centers, of Muslims together. They basically collaborated to help people in need. I would like to conclude by mentioning some hospitality initiatives, mutual ones. How can we overcome? We didn't mention that, but it's absolutely very much present, and that's true also in Nigeria, I imagine. How can we overcome the fear of the other? Because of his color of skin, because of his religion, which is the Muslim religion or Catholic religion. The only way is to do that through meeting and encounter. This is why many places are organizing open doors and open days in cult places, places of worship, different places where people come for visits and to learn how the rites are explained. And then also at the Catholic University, some Muslim speakers are invited as experts. For example, we invite them at the Catholic Institute of the Mediterranean in Marseille. We propose a specific training for the Christian Islamic meeting over 1 year. So for a 1 full year, we do struggle sometimes in finding more than 5 Christians, both religious men and women, who are willing to take this course of formation, which I find absolutely unacceptable in the light of our situation. But I think that this kind of formation, in this formation, we invite Muslim speakers to speak about the Quran, to speak about women and Muslim families. Sometimes it's done by both, by a Muslim and a Christian on the same theme. I'd like now to move to the third theme. So in our context in France, but I believe this is true also where you are, what are the obstacles to dialogue today? I would say that the first is what are the clashes of ignorance. At the end of the 20th century, we spoke about clashes of civilizations, but we believe that this is not the first and the main problem. I would say that in France, particularly among the younger generations, Christians, Muslims, Jewish, non-believers, agnostic, ignore each other's religion, and often their own religion. So in a classroom, there is a fight between Muslims and Christians, but actually neither knows much about their own religion. So in the name of secularism, there is no place for religion in the subjects taught in public schools, except through, French history or literature courses. The fear of proselytizing and proselytism at schools leads to ignoring the religious dimension of human beings. And often, in public education, teachers do not know how to react to Muslim pupils who are not afraid to intervene in class, because they are bound to neutrality. They basically slide into silence. So this is first of all, the shock of ignorance. The second element is the absence of Muslim scholars. Often you speak about imam, you use this word, but imams do not have exactly the same role as priests have in the Catholic Church. So which is actually lacking in Muslim communities in France is the lack of training of their religious leaders. It's actually a challenge, a big challenge that we are unable to cope with now for 20, 30 years. Secularism does not allow for theological training in the framework of the university as in Germany. I'm a bit jealous because I noticed that in Germany, the formation at university is actually progressing, while we are in a stalemate. So each trend develops its own place of training, but most often it is imams who have studied abroad or even come to France for a few years as officers from Algeria, Morocco, or Turkey. So this is a second obstacle in against dialogue and encounter. A third one is the influence of extremist currents. We have to have the courage of calling things by their name. I don't use the word radical because I believe that I don't want to be considered a moderate Christian. Maybe you have moderate Muslims, radical Muslims. I don't feel that these two words are appropriate when we speak about faith. I prefer the word extremism, fanatism. So I would like to just believe that a good definition of fanatism has been provided to me by Monsignor Ragoun Laham, who was the Archbishop of Tunis during the Arab Spring. In exchanging views on the big avenue, the Avenue Bourguiba in Tunis, during the Arab Spring, there was a debate, and the two had as a language, mother tongue language was Arabic. One was Palestinian and the other was Tunisian, so they both spoke in Arabic. And at the end of their debate, the counterpart said, but we're not fanatists. And Monsignor Lahum said, a fanatist uses up God while a believer serves God. So it is at a service. A fanatic uses God, but a believer is at the service of God. So we have a minority tempted by what the media call jihadism, just a few hundred out of the 5 million Muslims. With them, no dialogue is possible, since they call all of the others kuffar, that is, misbelievers. So not only Jewish or Christians, but also Muslims. And so beyond them, and what is far more worrying, is the development of currents inspired by Saudi Wahhabism, which is a very rigorous conception of Islam, a literalist reading of the Quran, a rejection of any critical reading, and of the use of reason in religious matters. This Wahhabism, inevitably we have to speak about politics, has spread in sub-Saharan Africa, in the Maghreb, and also in Europe. This religious ideology is transmitted via internet networks through videos coming from religious people living in the Gulf countries, unaware of the context of life in Europe. In working class neighborhoods, the same young people may be tempted to follow this rigid ideology while participating in the drug traffic, and which of course using violence as well. And that's when the situation is very difficult. The fourth obstacle, which is important for our theme today, which are the available theologies, philosophies, to understand and to consider ourselves as believers in our world today, also in the light of globalization. I would say that among the obstacles to dialogue among Muslims and Christians alike, there can be the view of the other, proposed or sometimes imposed on the other, different from me, by culture, origins, or religion. I believe you all know that motto or slogan, outside the church there is no salvation. I know that you have to actually consider that within a certain framework. Often it is used outside the church there is no salvation. has led the church to ignoring the other or even converting him at all or her at all costs so that he or she can be saved. Which are the theologies of salvation of the mission of the church, which are today proposed, taught, and spread to us as priests, future priests, religious, lay men and women, among Christians, but also among Muslims, and also in the places of formation of Muslims, which are fairly closed and traditional. What kind of formation do we propose? I believe that it's not by chance that Pope Francis repeats at length in his speeches, and I'm thinking about 2019 in Rabat, twice in the Cathedral of Rabat, where he was addressing and talking to religious priests, no to proselytism, no to proselytism. So, of course, he spoke about an important theology of so there's going to be just a few more minutes. So just a few more minutes before concluding your presentation. So theology is at stake, but also philosophy is at stake. Too many people function by saying, I have the truth, so the other is in error. And of course, Benedict XVI has recalled us in 2012. Of course, it is not we who possess the truth, but it is the truth that possesses us, Christ, who is the truth. So, of course, to a large majority of Muslims, only faith in God practiced on the path of Islam leads to salvation. Hence, their desire, and often friends, believe that we all become Muslims in order at best to be saved. So I want to conclude by mentioning two dimensions. What role for religious leaders in their context, and which religious dimension. So within Christian communities, the role of Christian leaders is to make the Christian community aware, to work on a theology of dialogue and its foundations in biblical revelation. That is, to make known to Christians the teaching of the magisterium on dialogue and encounter. A second responsibility for all religious leaders is to engage themselves on the ground in encounter and dialogue. In fact, there has to be encounter and dialogue. There is no dialogue without prior encounter. And to give priority to the field of education in all its forms, and to develop initiatives and pedagogies from school, to the faculty and training of ministers of religion and pastoral agents. So each in his community, in his tradition, Christians, Jewish and Muslims, should implement the first sentence signed by Pope Francis and Sheikh Al-Dajjab: faith leads the believer to see in the other a brother to support and love. And I believe that we should dare together lead imams and priests, rabbis, a word of rereading our scriptures and traditions. These are the three responsibilities, and of course a spiritual attitude. And I would like to basically quote Christian de Chergé, the prior of Notre-Dame de l'Atlas, the monastery in Tébrin, when he was caught up in the terrorist violence. And he meditated after the face-to-face meeting with the terrorist leader on Christmas Eve, 1993. And I read, I cannot ask the good Lord, kill him, but I can ask, disarm him. Afterwards, I said to myself, do I have the right to ask, disarm him? If I don't start by asking, disarm me and disarm us as a community. This is my daily prayer. I simply entrust it to you. And in this homily of Holy Thursday, 1995, just a bit before his death, the Word became brother, brother of Abel and of Cain, brother of Isaac and Ismael at the same time, brother of Joseph and of the 11 others who sold him, brother of the plain and where the army, and brother of the mountain of terrorists, brother of Peter, of Judas, and both of them in me. So at the roots of all of our attitude is that of Christ, Jesus Christ. Thank you very much. Thank you so much. Thank you, Father Christoph.
All right. I think we can, just a little note as we begin for those of you that may be interested. We will be able to provide translation, in translation, any of the talks or presentations that have been made so far. So if any of you are interested in being able to listen rather than listen and take notes, you can be reassured that the talks and the presentations will be available in translation as well. So thank you for the break, and thank you again to our translator who is keeping up with all of us. So we will go now to Bishop Matthew Kuka. Bishop, you're very welcome. Thank you for being with us. Bishop Kuka was born in Anchuna in the government area of Kaduna State in Nigeria. He received his education in the St. Joseph Minor Seminary School before he went to St. Augustine's Major Seminary, where he studied philosophy and theology. And he was ordained in December of 1976. He attended the University of Ibadan, where he obtained a diploma in religious studies. He received his Bachelor of Divinity from the Urban University in Rome and a master's degree in peace studies from the University of Bradford, United Kingdom in 1980. His academic searches and pursuits resulted in a PhD from the University of London's School of Oriental and African Studies. And he has also been involved with the group CAICID, the International Center for Interreligious and Intercultural Dialogue. Bishop Matthew, you are very welcome, and the floor is yours.
Okay, Chantal, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, I hope the picture over there is stronger and slightly better than it is here. I know I'm a black man, but what I'm seeing on my screen is not so clear. But I hope even if you can hear me, I'm sure you can, if you can see me clearly, you can hear me. Thank you very much for this very kind invitation. And I like to acknowledge the quality of presentation, quite conversational, but also based on very practical experiences of the previous speakers. Indeed, there is a sense in which a lot of the things that Christoph said, more or less took them out of my own notes. So naturally, of course, there will be a lot of overlapping, in terms of some of the themes and the issues. But essentially, I feel that given where we stand, there's need for some kind of conceptual clarification about what we understand as dialogue. Very often, it seems to be the case that when we mention the word dialogue, we're thinking about bishops and imams and traditional rulers, as it is the case in Nigeria. And this has created a bit of a distance. And of course, the result is that ordinary people think that dialogue is something that, as we say in Africa, big people or those who are in big positions do. And the distance is further reinforced by the perception that ordinary people also see these big people, their religious leaders, their bishops, their imams, and their traditional rulers in their beautiful robes, drinking tea together and slapping each other's backs and occasionally posing for photographs with the president and the governors and the big politicians. In my very cynical view, this has created rather a counter narrative, largely because it's not peculiar to Nigeria. I mean, a lot of people don't like politicians. And because the governments of the day are the ones that are doing some really horribly and terribly bad things, there often tends to be a kind of cynicism or a feeling of complicity by ordinary people. As we say in Nigeria, it is them. And when they say it is them, there is a sense in which by association we become largely guilty or complicit. And I make this preliminary point because this is how we continue to reinforce the conversation, that religious leaders come together and have these wonderful conversations, and that this constitutes dialogue. Now, in my view, a major shortcoming with this perception lies in the fact that very often most of us constitute the privileged class, where our lives are hardly in danger. So there is a sense in which we are actually merely speculating or talking about the pains and sufferings of people without necessarily wearing their shoes. And my experience is that in developing countries such as Nigeria, many parts of Africa and Asia, the issues of dialogue are actually issues of life and death. They're issues of survival, and then largely not issues of theology. There's very little that people are debating about theological issues or theological correctness. And my feeling is, because I've been on this road for a very, very long time, is that when we go to the bank to look at what we have deposited all these years, there's always very, very little to draw from in terms of what we have achieved. And in my view, this is largely because, as I said, of the poor framing of the issues, and then of course, the belief by ordinary people that dialogue is something that big people do. The next issue of which I think we need to clarify is what really is the content of dialogue. We're not, of course, except for occasional fanatics here and there and extremists on both sides, but I think even more so in Islam, the allegations that somebody has insulted the Holy Prophet, allegations that somebody has torn a page out of the Holy Quran, allegations over the claims that somebody has done something, has cursed God or whatever. The things that Christians have learned to live with. Very often, we have a rather combustible environment in Nigeria in particular, where these mere allegations that don't necessarily have to be proven provide ingredients for conflict. So the question I pose is, what really are the ingredients of dialogue? What do people dialogue about? And I imagine that if I were an ordinary Nigerian sitting down and watching the television and seeing the Sultan and seeing the Cardinal and seeing a few bishops on the screen, and I'm asked, what are they talking about? You'll probably be, well, they're talking about how terrible our situation is, but they will still go, they're probably not talking about unemployment, they're not talking about pensioners dying on the queues, they're not talking about salaries not being paid. And so there is a feeling that the contents of what we call dialogue is largely, and this is the way the government has seen it, and this is the way that we religious leaders have fallen victim to, the assumption that all we have to do is to engage in moral exhortation, encourage our people to obey the law, encourage them to live, keep the peace, even though in very many cases, in many parts of Africa, there is no peace to keep. And of course, the second and third difficulty is that who really forms dialogue? Now, I often joke with some of my Muslim friends that I have hardly ever been invited to a dialogue session by any Muslim, in part because the Muslim community believes that dialogue is something that government convenes. And if government convenes dialogue, government will pay for dialogue or dialogue sessions. So a substantial percentage, perhaps minimum 90% of the conversations around dialogue in Nigeria are things that either government convenes or they happen at the instance of the church or at the instance of civil society organizations and so on. So again, but as I said, we really don't get to the issues or to the substance of the issues that produce the violence. My argument then as now has been that actually the African state, notoriously corrupt and also notorious in its bad behavior, is actually the culprit, and it ought to be on the dock. And there's a sense in which, for me, dialogue should also be about interrogating the nature of this political, economic, and social structure that produce the toxicity that we see in our everyday life. No thanks to the colonial state and no thanks to the Western media, the Nigerian media has brought into a conversation, and I think this is the way the world has framed this conversation, that there is somehow an inevitability of conflict between quote-unquote Christians and Muslims. We are falling victim to a Western viewpoint that sees Africa largely in binary terms. Conflict in Africa is either Christians fighting Muslims or it is ethnic groups fighting one another. So you can talk about Rwanda without simply talking about Hutus doing terribly bad things to Tutsis. So this framing of the issues doesn't address the other dimension of our day-to-day lives, namely the nuances, the real issues why our communities still remain resilient despite all this. And that in reality, the whole question of Christians and Muslims, not only is it a Western construct, it's also a political construct that has gained currency, but doesn't speak to the other realities around which our people live. My mother died in July, and one of the widows, we used to work very closely with her, told us a story of her going to visit my mother at a time of great hunger around, people were really suffering. And somehow my mother had got 2 bags of rice. And a lot of women lined up, and these were women that my mother was also friends with in the church. But then this woman felt scandalized by the fact that she went and saw quite a good number of Muslim women, and my mother was generously giving out the rice to these women, irrespective of their status. She just saw people she has been associated with. But this woman who told us the story said she went and tapped my mother and said, look, there are also Muslim women here, and this rice ought to be for us. And then my mother says to her, I didn't know that hunger has a religion. The point I'm making is that ordinary people in their day-to-day lives are living lives of sharing, lives of solidarity, lives of standing together. We must therefore separate the reality of their lives from the horrible behavior of African politicians and Nigerian politicians. And my conclusion always in discussing these issues is to say that we are actually blaming the victim because it is the state and its operators and actors, namely the politicians and those in public life, whose malfeasance, whose unwillingness to manage the resources and the huge resources that are available to us, whose huge appetite for greed produces the tensions and the conflicts that ordinary people see themselves as victims. But unfortunately, the victimhood has been framed in religious terms. I worked as a priest in a part of Kaduna that was, by and large, pretty poor. I'm sure Sister Anne, Sister Hannah, Sister Kathleen can speak to those issues because we all shared the same geographical space. But those are areas where you saw people going through tremendous difficulties. And when I sank a borehole in the parish where I was working in, which was really a big deal, and we put out taps outside to enable people to come and fetch water, I went out one evening and saw a huge queue of ordinary people in the locality who had come to fetch water. And I said to them, I'm looking at all these people and I'm saying, okay, so is it that you don't have water because you're Muslims or you don't have water because you're Christians? The reality is that you don't have water because those who govern you are criminals and they are thieves. So really the point I'm making is that I am cynical about the perception that somehow there is a conflict between Christians and Muslims. And my argument is that there is a sense in which religion often provides a trigger, but very often the issues around which conflict is built, there are also issues of deprivation. Now, for the situation in Nigeria, we might ask the question, why has violence persisted over such a long period of time? Now, Nigeria has distinct, also complicated historical narratives about where Christians have come from, where Muslims have come from. The violence that happens in the name of religion in Nigeria, 99% of it has happened in the scene is contiguous with what is called northern Nigeria, and that scene is also contiguous to what constituted the Fulani Caliphate. And because Islam came into northern Nigeria with a sword and blood, despite the fact that this is 1804, and despite the fact that the British came 100 years later, up till today, the attraction of the sword, the shedding of blood, whether it is by the banditry or Boko Haram or whatever, my argument is that this segment of our history, we cannot understand why violence has become, should I use the word attractive, and why it is so prevalent in northern Nigeria, if we don't situate it within the context of the nature of the history, of how Islam came into that part of northern Nigeria. Because hitherto, before 1804, Muslims were living in peace with one another. So my argument is that the conquering, sword-wielding nature of Islam, produced by the jihad, has meant that over the years, up till today, the word jihad, empire building, power, dominance, continues to hang around in the horizon. Unfortunately, our conversations about dialogue don't really talk about some of these things. The British left us a horrible architecture of power in the same way that they did in many parts of the developing world. A lot of horribly bad things that there's very little we can do about. They drew very strange lines among people and ended up with what we've left, with what we've ended up with. In fact, there is a British colonial officer who has made the case very, very clearly that Nigeria was actually not programmed by the British to survive, and that the decision to leave 3/4 of the landmass and 3/4 of the population in northern Nigeria and to constitute and literally compel a Christian minority and force them to live within a region that they were, with a community that had literally had a warring history over so many years, was not going to be sustainable. The British themselves set up a panel in 1958 to examine all this, and it was very clear that leaving so much power in the hands of the northern Muslims and leaving such a huge population and 3/4 of the landmass of Nigeria under the control of a community that had come to be largely by wielding a sword of conquest, was going to have implications for Nigeria. So then as now, what we are witnessing in Nigeria, whether we talk about Boko Haram or whether we talk about banditry, by whatever name, we must understand that a lot of this has been the contestation between the rest of Nigeria, whether we want to build an egalitarian democratic society anchored on the principles of justice, fairness, and equity, or whether there are people who are still nostalgic about empire building and who saw the presence of the British as an interruption and saw independence as an opportunity for them to continue with this problem of domination. These are some of the issues that continue to hold us down in Nigeria, about which very little is being discussed. So if we ask ourselves, how did we get to where we are? It is that from 1956 through 1960, when Nigeria became independent, right through, maybe quite frankly, I'm mistaken, I should say 1922 even, when Nigeria began a debate about the constitution. The long and short of it is that we've never concluded a debate about the kind of constitution we want without the Muslims insisting that they would rather live under Sharia law. Then as now, the seeds of the confusion that we are facing today can be located around that contradiction. And it is also quite interesting that Zamfara State, which is also part of my diocese, where Sharia law was declared and where Muslims adopted Sharia, has now ended up as one of the most violent spots, in Nigeria today. And my argument is that the inability of the Nigerian state to unpack its constitution and really begin to think about how we can create a country, that we share common citizenship. The speaker who talked about France made the point in which literally it doesn't matter who you are or what you believe and so on and so forth. Being French is everything. For us in Nigeria, being Nigerian is the last thing that is the last thing every citizen talks about. And this is why we've ended up where we have, where we have now. That is, we have a situation where if you ask the average Nigerian, including myself, we don't get a sense that there is a country that we can be very proud of because, as somebody said in a song, really, what have you done for me lately? The average Nigerian asks himself, what has the Nigerian state done for him or her lately? The young people who were involved in the NSAS protests can't find jobs. There are millions of graduates over the years, they can't find jobs. There are millions of ordinary people who have retired, they can't get their pensions paid. The entire system continues to malfunction. The result, of course, is that this obsession with religion can be seen within the context of people struggling for survival. And as I said, when the French talk about what happened after the World Cup, Nigeria has had similar opportunities, but we've never used them as an opportunity to build a nation, in part because, as I said, of the overbearing presence of, in this particular case, Islam, because Christianity has really never been a religion for organizing for political power. In most parts of Nigeria, ethnic affiliations are more important instruments for political organization than religion. So Christianity, you can't mobilize politicians, in Nigeria using religion, in part because, as I said, the ethnic allegiance is much stronger. But because Islam has used religion to build an empire, it has become the principle for organization. But going forward, especially within the context of Fratelli Tutti, is to ask the question, can we really talk about brothers and sisters? I'm living in a country where there are people who still believe in the verses of the sword in the Holy Quran, who tell me that there is a wall of difference between believers and unbelievers. And that there are people who are still thinking that they are waging a jihad in a democracy, and people who are still calling others infidels, and people who still say that you cannot convert from Islam to Christianity. If you do, it's under the pain of death. But still, in the same environment where people are still by kidnapping and other means, we have cases of many young children, especially girls, who are being kidnapped. And the next thing, before we know what is happening, we are told they've become Muslims. So it is acceptable, it is convenient, and it is expected that people can convert to become Muslims, but you cannot convert from Islam. We have a situation where the idea that two young people are in love and a Christian wants to marry a Muslim, it can only be accepted on the grounds that it is assumed that the Christian party will become a Muslim. So issues of intermarriages between Christians and Muslims in northern Nigeria is non-existent. It exists in the southwest of Nigeria and perhaps in parts of the Middle Belt. The point I'm making is that these are some of the problems we're still dealing with, and they place a lot of strain on the notions of dialogue and common brotherhood. Now, as I try to round up, what does this say to us about common citizenship, which we need to have before we can talk about the principles of fraternity? I picked just 3 paragraphs. One is paragraph 11 of the document, where it is said, and if I may please just crave your indulgence, paragraph 11 says, on our own days, however, seem to be showing signs of certain regression. Ancient conflicts that we thought were long buried are breaking out anew, while instances of a myopic, extremist, resentful, and aggressive nationalism is on the rise. This is an existential reality for us in Nigeria. Paragraph 13 says, quote, as a result, there is a growing loss of a sense of history, which leads to even further breakup. A kind of deconstructionism whereby human freedom claims to create everything starting from zero is making its headway in today's culture. And finally, paragraph 75 is one of my favorite. He says, robbers equally find secret allies in those who pass by. This is after Fraternity begins to talk about the parable of the man who fell victim to thieves. He says, robbers, in bracket, usually find secret allies in those who pass by and look the other way. There is a certain interplay between those who manipulate and cheat society and those who, while claiming to be detached and impartial critics, live off that system and its benefits. Point I'm making, therefore, is that if our dialogue can be mistakenly construed to be an act of a complicit engagement with a thoroughly corrupt state that is unable to deal with the issues of its duties and responsibility to its citizens, and if our dialogue simply exhorts our people to live in peace when there is no peace for them to keep, and if our dialogue is just a long litany of moral obligations about citizen responsibility to the state, without a corresponding focus on the responsibility of the state to its citizens, we are on a wrong path, in my view. Finally, the history of the persecution of Christians in northern Nigeria, the manifestations of human rights violations, the denial of access to key places in public life in northern Nigeria, the fact that a lot of that, most of what has come to the fore now in Nigeria is what Christians have been suffering for a very long period of time, where Christian minorities have no place in the bureaucracy in almost all the 12 core northern states. They are not in the state assemblies, they are not in the local government councils, they are not in the state bureaucracy. Where they are, a lot of Christians are literally treated as second-class citizens. We still have a culture where there is still denial of access to Christians to build places of worship. We still have problems of religious instructions, in schools, and the issue of Christian children being almost compelled, to study, or are being exposed to Islamic religion. In one of my schools in Zamfara State, the commissioner for education suddenly asked his daughter to wear hijab and ordered the principal of the school that children must begin to wear hijab. Well, we resisted because I told, luckily for us, our laws were pretty clear. We said, we built a school, we didn't force you to come to our school. You're going to come to our school, you must comply. So there is this constant pushing of the envelope that we're experiencing with Christianity being severely under pressure. And so the dialogue for many of our people is a luxury. And many of us that are making the effort are gradually becoming, let me use the expression, an endangered species, because the violence around which people live makes it very difficult for us to convince them that dialogue is something that is very important. And as I said, very, very finally, if there is such a word, there is need for us to institutionalize a culture of human rights and a sense of justice and fairness for all. Dialogue cannot be a substitute for that. And if dialogue does not raise the bar of human dignity and insist on certain irreducible minimums of human conduct that are acceptable and certain rights that adhere to us as citizens, there's no amount of dialogue that will reverse the violence that continues to manifest itself, because tragic as it is, our citizens have become victims of violence, and whatever the state itself is the agency of violence, primary agency of violence, and ordinary people are just struggling for their survival. So in my view, there is an urgent need for us to take very seriously the issue of dialogue, but to take it beyond just being a conversation that people who wear religious garbs and their collaborators in government participate in. I thank you very much for your patience. God bless you.
Thank you very much, Bishop Matthew, for your sharing and your own challenge to us. And light, I think, in the midst, a strong light that asks us all to go beyond perhaps where we are and perhaps where we are comfortable, but to recognize. We have just about 13 minutes left before our time is up. And we did have some questions that came earlier on in the presentations. I would like to at least state what some of them were, if we have a moment to be able to answer them. That would be helpful, I think. So there was a question here to Père Christoph. It is in French, so I will try to read it in French. So
it's the manifestation of against the interreligious dialogue of understanding within the Christian community. If this is the truth, how would you respond to it? I think that this is one of the most difficult things. And I probably would have liked to maybe talk about this with Bishop Kuka, because when Pope Francis and Pope St. John II speak, they speak for one part of the church, and others do not accept that. So within the Christian community, there is something that we need to respect. That is, people are afraid. They are not only afraid of the other, but even in the case of France, which is not the same case as Nigeria, often this is because we don't know each other and we don't meet each other. Young people, young students of elegant, Catholic schools do not meet Muslims from working class neighborhoods. And when there is an encounter, things can change. So those who are, the young people who are involved in dialogue and who are entrusted, because at the time I was in charge at the Conference of Bishops, are considered as naive and viewed as naive. I think we have to be intelligent. We cannot, of course, have a dialogue with people who refuse such dialogue. And this is the reason why I concluded my intervention saying this isn't a question of Christian faith. Jesus was naive. We are his disciples, Christ's disciples. A situation that we're living in France, which is not a situation of violence, where is completely different from the situation in Nigeria. I think it is a need of the Christian faith to meet the other. And it's a question of faith, because the Holy Spirit is given not only to the Christians, but it's also given to the other. And I have something that I can receive from the other. And this is what we're trying to do. This requires an important initiative and effort to raise awareness. Of course, you cannot impose a dialogue in a hostile way. It's a bit like a struggle. It's a struggle with which I was invited to live my ministry as a priest, with being clear-minded and targeted, and particularly promoting dialogue between people who don't know each other and who learn to know each other and who have different sensitivities. Of course, the Muslim community with the Christian communities, I worked together. When I was working at the Conference of Bishops, I was often insulted by Catholic websites. And so you have to know that when a bishop comes to France to inaugurate a mosque, you receive, on the one hand, letters saying, I'm not going to fund you anymore, I won't give you any donation. So this can rise some tensions and conflicts. So we as Christians have tried to learn and live with these tensions, but we try to be naive, and we have to try to be well on our feet, well on the ground. But the situation that you live in Maghreb, and also the situation that I mentioned, is exactly that. I think there is an educational work to be done.
We also have a question for Bishop Matthew. If it is at all possible, despite the complex situation of Nigeria, to count on the fraternity and friendship between leaders of different religious groups as vital for dialogue.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I have my relationship with. I'm on pretty good terms with literally a cross section of the leaders of Islam. I don't have problems. You know, I give you an example of something that happened to me about 2 years ago. I was at the airport in Abuja waiting to connect a flight. And we were sitting in the lounge when a gentleman walked in. And then I was in my clerical regalia. And this gentleman decided to introduce us. And he says, you know, this is Bishop Kuka. He's the Catholic bishop of the Diocese of Sokoto. And as I stretched out my hand to shake the gentleman, another person came from, I didn't know where he came from. He just came and literally separated our hands and started wagging his finger. He said, stop calling him the Catholic Bishop of Sokoto. He's our bishop. So don't call him Catholic Bishop because he is our bishop. And the gentleman who was speaking, we were going to board the same flight. I didn't know who he was, but he's a Muslim. So, but I'm saying that the life and death issues that people face are beyond friendships. Friendship is a necessary, but it's not a sufficient condition for guaranteeing some of the issues of inequalities that we are finding in our communities. Now, what are my experience in northern Nigeria is that the elite treasure Catholic schools. They love Catholic schools, and they send their children to Catholic schools. But they also are happy with the Catholic Church because sometimes we are not asking the difficult questions. And they think that we're here to serve, and we render service without a word. But also, there is the percentage of those whose children are in Catholic schools is so insignificant that it doesn't talk to the 98% of those who have no contact with Catholic education and whose only contact and communication with Christianity is based on the kind of things that the imams, who are themselves uneducated, are exposing them to. Namely, the kind of rhetoric that suggests, which is what the kind of thing that Boko Haram has continued to happen, that actually the overthrow of the existing Nigerian state is a possibility, and that the institutionalization of an Islamic state is a possibility. Now, we often notice that when we are having these conversations, it is difficult to get the Muslim leaders buy-in part because they are not religious leaders, they are traditional rulers who are presenting themselves as religious leaders. So, and because they are appointed by government and they collect their salaries from government, there is very little that they can do. So my argument is that friendship should not be a substitute, for the difficult questions of seeking a just, fair, and equitable society in Nigeria or anywhere else.
Thank you. Just to add on to your comments, something that came from one of the questions, that I think what you raise also reminds us that dialogue can be also used as a tool of silencing what is really needed and the actions of people who need courage in order to do the actions of solidarity that they're called to do. In our remaining minutes, I want to go back to our first speaker, to Sister Chantal, and situate us in the arena of formation, which for all of us who are parts of religious communities, we are also aware of. And it is one of the first places where our newest members receive their formation. And so the question is posed to Sister Chantal: if you feel, Sister, that there is enough focus on interreligious dialogue, and I would say life and activity in formation programs within religious congregations, considering that we now live in a very multicultural and multi-faith society and world.
I would say that the many religious congregations live and are aware of the fact that we need to form the younger ones in order to live together in our societies, which are ever more intercultural and interreligious. Now, in the assemblies of superiors major in our countries, they take time to form, because how can you weave a link of fraternity, of friendship, and of respect and esteem if you do not know the other? And how do you know him? You know him in the daily life, in normal relations, but we also have to accompany that to that study. We have to study Muslim religion, Christian religion. So these are different systems with their own consistency. And Pierre Claverie insisted a lot, saying that words do not have the same meaning. When we use one word like prayer, I do my prayer, I pray, which does not correspond to the same in the other religion, although we're praying the same God. But all of these believers, we have to go beyond. So we certainly do need to know also the basic principles of the others in order to have a relationship. But I want to underline the importance of learning the language, which is of great importance, because behind that you appreciate the language. Behind the language you have the culture, the mindset. And Pierre Claverie was saying that in a wonderful way. It requires a geological patience. It's not something that you can do in 24 hours, and it's not like the Petit Prince was saying. It's something that you have to tame, like he was taming the animal. And this can be done on a in daily life, but we have to just go beyond. We have to move a step forward with our neighbors. And this is what we do in our country, in Algiers. We spend time in discussing and sharing principles like life, death, freedom of beliefs, freedom. What does all of this mean when there are so many acts of violence, of disruption, and religion is often is manipulated? And this is part of the debate, and I think it is very important to allow the younger ones to meet, to have conferences between themselves. I'm not speaking about only of us. It's often religious communities who are invited to, or ask them to be formed, to have some courses of Islamology, theory of religions, and learn the language in order to be able to develop actions together jointly in order to strengthen this bond of fraternity in respect and esteem. And what surprises me, when I arrive here, people can say, I receive just as much as I give. So we learn to appreciate what the other person is giving me. So from its spiritual life as a believers, and I am far more enriched by what I give. There is a great source of enrichment. We have Christian de Chergé had created the group of Riba with Monsignor Crodeau, who has been one of the bishops, and this group, Riba et Salam, is the link of peace. So since a number of years, we are trying through a number of meetings to build fraternity and friendship simply in sharing. We have studied together the first document of Pope Francis together with the Imam Ahmed Taled. We have studied that together. So we find opportunities to engage jointly, and during the COVID, for example, we have brought food packages to students on campus who did not have a possibility of eating and leaving the campus. As Father Christoph Hoku was saying, we are Christians, and our faith is dialogue. I have to go towards the other because it's part of my faith. Trinity is a communion, of love, and God is in dialogue. Starts dialogue with the other. God is dialogue. So our faith is actually the backbone, and I have to start a dialogue with the other, and certainly not denying my faith. I don't own God, I don't own truth, as Pierre Claverie, so I do need the truth of the other, myself, to grow. So formation is absolutely indispensable.
Yes, I think at every level and at every age that we live.
Yes.
I'm so sorry that we have run out of time. There are many comments and questions. Perhaps we can make a listing of those, or you can share with each other what some of your questions were across different borders. Also, in terms of formation, we have been given information that there are many places of formation and works that are being accomplished together by Catholic priests and sisters together with others of other religions. This has been a very rich sharing, and it is always time that sometimes is against us as well. We've heard so much about the importance of relationships, of encountering, of welcome, of knowledge, of knowing our own identities and being formed in them and rooted in them. A lot of what the obstacles can be to our formation, of what the obstacles can be to our daily living, of the great difference between the goodness of ordinary people who are caring for each other and noticing each other, and those whose other appetites for greed, as Bishop said, keep ordinary people from each other. The important questions of who forms dialogue, where does it happen, what is its content, what does it include? Is it a luxury, or is it something that includes issues of the life and death of the people around us and those far away from us? I think we also touched on the responsibilities and the calls that our faith gives us, and that a rereading of our scriptures and our traditions can help us to be rooted, but also to face the other, who is our brother and our sister, before the eyes of God, who is both a mystery and who carries the dignity of the divine within them. And so I'd like to thank everyone for your participation. You may have noticed that we had over 200 persons participating in the webinar, for which we are very grateful. I'm grateful to our three speakers, to Sister Chantal, to Father Christoph, and to Bishop Matthew, for Claudia, who has organized us all and brought us together and kept us organized and on time, for our translation, certainly, and for Patrizia, who helped us in our technical ways, all those people we see and those who we did not see. And perhaps we can all take as an example that Samaritan who was walking by, who saw and was able to do, and perhaps we are called to do the same. So thank you all very much for this rich conversation. May it continue where you are, and I'm sure we will continue it as well. Many blessings to each one.